My name's Peter Ayres. I'm the Chief Executive of the Church's Conservation Trust, and thank you so much for joining us for this second in our series of lectures during the lockdown period. We're very excited to have Father Charles Card-Reynolds with us today, and I'll introduce him in a bit more detail just following just a bit of a description about what we are about. So we are a national charity who look after a collection of 356 very historic churches right across England, and we take on about 2 or 3 more churches every year and look after them on behalf of the nation in perpetuity, so forever. Our sites are all free to access, and we work very hard to make sure that as many people value these amazing buildings right across the country as possible. Our strategy is really aimed at how we can support communities right across England look after this amazing collection of historic parish churches, church buildings that we have. It's unparalleled, really, this collection, not just the ones in the CCT collection, but there's also thousands and thousands of others, which are very, very beautiful. And we need to make sure that we can pass those on to future generations. So I think that, as you'll be aware, COVID-19 has hit everybody very, very hard and in lots of different ways, from the very personal, and our hearts go out to all those people who've lost loved ones and relatives through this period of time. There's also been a big impact on the economy and those people losing their jobs and struggling to keep their businesses going, that we also feel very, very concerned about. And also, this doesn't the charity sector doesn't escape this concern, and we're facing a considerable loss of income due to COVID-19, because this is the time of year when we'd normally do a lot of our events and our church tours, and people would be visiting our churches and donating there. So we really would be grateful for your help and assistance, and please feel free to donate, which I believe you can do via our website, visitchurches.org.uk/donate, or you can text CCT to 70311, and that will donate us £3, which would be very great. And you can become a member as well and support our work in the long term, which and you benefit from receiving our members magazines, emails, and also a special rate on our historic church tours. So do sign up and visit our website, and please do donate what you feel you can to support the work, to make sure that these buildings are passed on to the next generation and the generation beyond. So let's move on to today. I've learned a lot already today. Oak Apple Day. I've got my oak leaf, which I was instructed to wear, but as you will see from the visual, my leaf pales into insignificance when confronted with Father Charles's rather fantastic display on his collar there. Father Charles joins us today really in his role as a chaplain to the Society of King Charles the Martyr. So this is Charles I, who was the first person to be canonized by the Anglican Church, which puts him in a very interesting position. Father Charles also has many other day jobs as well as undertaking this. So he's a vicar of St Bartholomew's at Stamford Hill and has been there since 2006. But he's also the chairman and director of the Fellowship of St John the Evangelist, which supports mission in the UK, South Africa, the West Indies and India. And he's a commissary for the Diocese of the Windward Islands. And I believe, Charles, you'd said that you should be out in the West Indies right now. And so their loss is our gain, I suppose, is what we have to say about that. So thank you very much. So the society itself was formed in 1894 so I'm just reading this because it's quite complicated, as a church defence union under the banner of the Martyr King, and its initial prime objective was intercessory prayer for the defence of the Church of England against the attack of her enemies, which is pretty serious stuff. So I think they've probably evolved a bit since that first time. I'm sure Charles will let us know about that. And we're very excited to have you here. So I will stop rambling on, because what I have to tell you is nowhere near as interesting as what Father Charles has to tell us. So over to you.
Hello, thank you very much for your kind invitation to deliver this talk today. 29th of May is Oak Apple Day, also known as Restoration Day, and colloquially known as Pinch Bum Day. maybe not something you necessarily want to Google, in that this was the day on which the Cavaliers returned, and it was the end of Puritanism, hence the playfulness of this day and the wearing of oak leaves to remember the return of King Charles II on the 29th of May 1660. He returned to the country at the invitation of the parliaments, and he resumed his reign. This day, Restoration Day, was a day of rejoicing. There was a commemoration often held in church, and I've got here a prayer book from the 1670s, contemporary with soon after the Restoration. And as you can see here, there is a picture of Charles riding into London with his other courtiers. It was a great day of rejoicing and held as such for generations afterwards, with church ales, with dancing, with bonfires, and general playfulness to mark this time that Puritanism was at an end. During the period of the Commonwealth, which had marked that decade and a half of the period after the English Civil Wars, the whole of the Church of England and Anglicanism in Scotland was brought to an end. Bishops were banished, Anglican clergy were ejected from their churches. There was the seizing of a lot of church land and property and assets, and the imposition of Puritanism. And so this day was not only the day of the restoration of the monarchy, the restoration of the state, of ancient laws, but it was also the restoration of the church as well. It marked a change from Cromwell's years, of course, of military rule. So, George, if we can go to the first image, please. So you see here King Charles II resting beneath the royal oak, from where this Oak Apple Day gets its name. And this was recalling an incident after the Battle of Worcester in 1651, when King Charles tried to regain the throne, but was defeated. And then you can see in the background, there's some ships. That's the River Severn in the background. He found that he could not flee easily back to the continent, and he had to hide in an oak tree at Boscobel. And in the tree, you'll notice 3 crowns. And those are the 3 crowns of England, Ireland, and Scotland. We can go on to the next slide, please. Here we have an image of King Charles II, produced while he was in exile in the Low Countries. And you're starting to see this iconography about the monarchy, about King Charles I and King Charles II. So if you look at the right hand of the king, you will see a small building, and that is the banqueting house on Whitehall in London, which was the place where King Charles I had been beheaded, had been martyred. And above Whitehall, directly above it, you can see a star rising. So this is a symbol of King Charles I in the heavens, and an angel is now bestowing onto King Charles II the crown. Move now to the third of the slides. This is a little later in date, probably from about 1660. And you can see the iconography is developing here. Here we see King Charles II, the main figure here, and he's reaching up. And King Charles I is reaching out of heaven, passing the royal crown to him. From Carolus to Carolus, it says. You can see the angel holding a laurel wreath and a palm of victory above King Charles II's head. And beneath the king, you can see two spheres. One is the royal orb, and the other is a globe with the word Britannia written on it, showing that the king can only stand on Britannia if he is also standing on the orb which has the word peace on it. So he is bringing peace now after years of war. And then in the background, you can see that royal oak again. Many of you may be familiar with the Royal Oak as the name of a pub. It's the second most popular name for a pub in the UK. And King Charles II, you can see those three crowns again, and King Charles II is hidden amidst the branches. That's where he hid after the Battle of Worcester. This day is also known as Oak Apple Day, and to see an oak apple in an oak tree this day was meant to be a reminder of the face of the king as he hid in the branches of the oak tree. Move on to slide 4, thank you. With the restoration of the church, the liturgies of the church were able to be re-established once more, and the sacraments were re-established, the services of the church. Many of you will be familiar with that date of 1662 as the name of the date given to the Book of Common Prayer. And it was between 1660 and 1662 that there was some reforms to the liturgies of the Church of England. And here is a copy of the Book of Common Prayer from 1663. So very recently republished. And you will see as the frontispiece, here is a portrait of King Charles II with those three crowns above him once more. And shining upon him is the Shekinah, the royal light of divine light, which inspires him to fulfill his destiny to be the monarch of these three kingdoms. So we can end the slide, please. One of the themes when we think about King Charles I in particular is the teaching and notion of the divine right of kings. So this is a biblically based notion that God has provided for stable governance, the rule of monarchs. And this was very dear to King Charles I, as it had been to his father, King James I and VI. At his coronation in 1626, King Charles I became known as the White King. And this was because at his coronation, unusually, he was dressed in white coronation robes. These were the robes of a deacon, the robes of a servant. So he was taking on that role of servanthood. He saw the divine right as one of being able to serve his people. It was a sacred office. The sermon that was preached at his coronation was with the text, "Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life." And this very much marked his very conscientious form of rule, a conscience that often troubled him throughout his life. If we can move then to the next slide, please. This is perhaps one of the most famous images of King Charles I as King Charles the Martyr. It accompanied a book that was published within hours of his martyrdom, his beheading in 1649. And the book and this image carried the title of the icon Basilike, the image of the king. And here we see King Charles kneeling before an altar, and the iconography that forms this picture is made up of three crowns that are before him, one at his foot, next in his hand, and the other in the heavens. This is a way in which the artist, William Marshall, in consideration of the book, The Icon Basilicae, portrays Charles as taking on this sacerdotal, this servanthood associated with his kingship. So he looks up to heaven, and the words that come from his eye are, "I look to heaven," and there he sees the heavenly crown. That is what he seeks, and yet he can only see that heavenly crown by picking up the crown in his hand, which, as you'll see, is the crown of thorns, Christ's crown of thorns, and putting below him the royal crown, the earthly crown, which has the title of splendid and heavy. The crown of thorns has the title of bitter and light. And so he passes from one crown to the next, to the next. He has stepped into a church, and behind him you can see emblems of the type of life that he had experienced. You'll see directly behind him a palm tree, and it was believed that a palm tree could only grow straight if it had weights hanging from it. Virtue grows beneath weight is the description that is attached to the tree. And then above the tree, you see a storm raging at sea. And the title for that is Triumphantly Immovable. That Charles's life is like a rock in the midst of a storm, being buffeted by the waves and also by the gale being blown out of the sky towards him. The disputes that characterize much of his reign had really been developing for a century and more. It was really the outworking of the Reformation. Elizabeth I had been very pragmatic, and so in many ways had James I. Charles was of a rather different character in that he was much more conscientious in terms of he believed that there needed to be a certain direction. Whereas before we see, for instance, the Pilgrim Fathers leaving the British Isles to go elsewhere, during Charles's reign, there was no active persecution to death of those who held different religious views. And this, of course, allowed dissent to arise within the realms, which at last erupted into the English civil wars of the 1640s. If we can move on to the next slide, and you'll see another version of the Icon Basilicae. This is a very lavish version. It's a large folio-sized edition. And you'll see in the background, again, that imagery of the storm at sea. But here you see Charles as the captain of a ship, the ship of state. He is alone on the ship, trying to steer it through the storm. The Icon Basilicae, the book that attached itself to this image, had been written by Charles and probably adapted later by the Bishop of Exeter. And it was written during those years of Charles's confinement, particularly in Carisbrooke Castle. And there is a great sense of introspection, of penitence, of a man trying to win his soul from the devastating experiences of the Civil War. If we can go back, please, if we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So here we see another version of the icon Basilike. On the left-hand side, you will see Charles being paralleled with King David and King Solomon. In his hand, you see that he is holding a trident, and this recalls the ship money that Charles raised as a tax, which formed the first stable Royal Navy. And again, we see that image of Charles at the helm of the ship on the right-hand side. At the bottom of the right-hand side, you will see the description, the Royal Library, and then below it, the name of the printer, Henry Seal, and the date of when the book was published in 1659. By 1659, the Cromwellian regime was crumbling, was coming to an end, and negotiations had started to restore Charles II to the throne. And I draw your attention to that date and the name of the printer, because if we now move on to the next slide, this book dates from 1649, the year in which Charles I was martyred. And if you look again on the right-hand side, you will see the place of printing is detailed as The Hague, and the name of the printer as Sam Brown. Well, both of these are false impressions. Sam Brown, you might as well say Joe Bloggs, really. I mean, it's trying to disguise the name of the printer, and this book was likely to have been printed, in fact, in London, but they're trying to disguise where it has been printed and place it into the safety of the Netherlands rather than in London. And the reason for that was that it was an offence that could lead to imprisonment, even to own one of these copies of the icon Basilike. On the left-hand side, you see the frontispiece, which again depicts Charles, the defender of the faith, and you'll see the globe details, the church in Scotland and the church in England, and this is the faith that he is defending. Around his neck, he wears the Lesser George. This is the Order of St. George, and a lot of portraits of King Charles show him with that blue ribbon or blue sash of the George. He wore it and modelled a lot of his life after the pattern of St. George the Martyr. Again, this is an image. You will see the name of the engraver, William Marshall, at the bottom of the globe itself. And William Marshall was imprisoned for producing these iconographic images of the king. So whoever really the Sam Brown is, he was wise to keep his name to himself. You can go on to the next slide, please. We've been looking at the title pages and frontispieces of books. Here's the outside of one of these books from the 1650s. And you will see on the right-hand side, the image in the middle of the book impressed into the leather. You can see King Charles. You can see a skull, a memento mori. Around him is the crown of thorns, and above the celestial crown with stars as the diadem. And this is a very familiar form of iconography. But if you look on the left-hand side, you will see that the spine of the book is entirely plain. So if you were an Anglican during those difficult years of the 1650s and you had this on your bookshelf, you wouldn't wish to be drawing attention to what was inside the book. So the spine of these Royalist books were often left in this plain state. We can move on to the next slide, please. I mentioned before, between 1660 and 1662, the Book of Common Prayer was reissued and some reforms to the liturgies took place. And this included the introduction of an order of service for the commemoration of the martyrdom of King Charles I. And here you will see that the order of morning prayer, here there was morning prayer and evening prayer. And here is an illustration of King Charles on the scaffold with the banqueting house of Whitehall in the background. But of course, when Charles was beheaded, those who were in the crowds wouldn't have been able to see very much of what was happening, because railings draped with black crepe were placed around the dais on which he was beheaded. The one historically accurate detail here is the block. It was a very low block, and again this was deliberately used in order that he would have to lie below the level at which anyone could see what was happening. And so when he was beheaded, he was lying almost horizontally. I can move then to the next slide, please. Along with that service for King Charles the Martyr, there was also the Restoration service that was added in 1662, and a third service for the gunpowder treason that was recalling events with Guy Fawkes on the 5th of November. With all three services, this was a way in which the British were defining themselves. They were seeing themselves under God's providence and with his guiding hand, and as you can see with Guy Fawkes there, God's all-seeing eye looking after the nation and seeing what is happening. The gunpowder plot was a service that really defined Britain as not being like continental Baroque Roman Catholicism, and the commemoration of King Charles the Martyr was defining that we weren't like continental Protestants, that the Church of England and the British character, religious character, was somewhere in between those two. You'll notice above the image of King Charles that his martyrdom is referred to as a murdered. And this was important, not to recognize what had happened to him as an execution. It wasn't an execution because there hadn't been a lawful court that had passed sentence on him. It was a murder. It was a martyrdom. It was very much part of the way in which the 17th century read and understood what had happened. We can go to the next slide. On the 30th of January, the anniversary of the martyrdom, one of the events of the day was the gathering of the court, the royal court, of the Houses of Parliament, both the Commons and the Lords, to hear a set-piece sermon. And these sermons were asserting the character of the nation state, that church and king formed the state together, and that the parliaments were there to serve the spiritual and temporal needs of the people. And the next slide, please. Here is a much later version from 1763, which shows how this continued. If we come back to me, please, George. This tradition of the King Charles sermon and the observance of Restoration Day and the gunpowder treason and the commemoration of King Charles the Martyr continued well into the 19th century. And they were only removed from the Book of Common Prayer in 1859. And the reason for their removal at that time was really twofold. One was that the character of the services, which was one of a lamentation, did not particularly capture the mood of the time. But also there was this assertion associated, particularly with the commemoration of King Charles, but also the Restoration, that there was essentially a spiritual aspect to the life of the state. And by the mid-19th century, the Parliament was no longer an Anglican assembly, and this was widely criticised and with Whig objections. And so the services were removed from the Book of Common Prayer, although not the days themselves from the calendar, or not officially so, and they started to be reintroduced back into the calendar by the 1870s. As Peter Ayres was mentioning in the introduction, the Society of King Charles the Martyr was founded in 1894, and during the 1890s there was a particular concern of a lack of the spiritual and the religious and the ethical nature to the state, and the society was founded to pray for the return of those qualities to the life of the nation. It was a decade that was characterized in the political life of the country with much cynicism and aggressive imperialism. If we could then move on to the next slide, please. And one of the works of the society from its early life has been the collecting and custodianship of relics of the king. Famously, King Charles was said to have worn 2 vests or 2 shirts on the day of his martyrdom. It was a cold January day, and he didn't want to be seen to be shaking from the cold, as if he was scared. And you will see in the center of the reliquary a small square of fabric. This is a square of the shirt that he was wearing, and below it is a fringe from the gloves that he was wearing. These relics were collected from the scaffold immediately after his martyrdom. And then if we go on to the next slide, please. This is a small piece of hair, probably from his beard, and the rock crystal heart was a way in which this particular relic could be contained. It can be placed into the heart. It's been taken out for reasons of preservation. And then a third slide, please. And here is the ring that Charles was said to be wearing. And the society cares for a number of these relics. There's 6 other such reliquaries, which we see as a great privilege to care for. And these are displayed each year on the 30th of January at the banqueting house. I'd like to end the slide, please, George. So on the 30th of January each year at the banqueting house on Whitehall, there's a commemoration at 11:40 outside the banqueting house at the place where the scaffold once stood, and then inside at noon there is Mass celebrated according to the 1637 liturgy, which is often called the Scottish liturgy, which dates from King Charles's reign. And it's very moving to be in the banqueting house on that day, in that place where King Charles spent his last hours. He had to wait for many hours more than he expected, for the news that the beheading would indeed go ahead. His last words on the scaffold were, remember everything about his life, what he sought to achieve. And particularly, I think, in the icon Basilike, how he was seeking to win his soul through conscience, through confession, through understanding the faults that had followed his life. So that concludes what I would like to say by way of introduction to these various objects and images associated with the cult of King Charles. I'd like to thank the Trust very much for this invitation to speak about St. Charles, King and Martyr. And if there are any questions, I'll attempt to answer them, but I'll do my best.
Well, thank you so much, Father Charles. That was really insightful, and I know I've personally learned a lot from that. As Father Charles said, there's now going to be some time for you to ask questions. So using the Facebook comment box there, please do type any questions you'd like to put to Father Charles, and we will try our best to answer them. So, Father, I have had one question come in already. How did these relics survive, and how many are there? I know you mentioned there about 6, I think you said, but do you have any particular favourite as well?
A lot of them were collected immediately after the king had died and were treasured possessions handed down through generations within families. I showed you, for instance, the ring. One of the remarkable details about the ring is its state of preservation. I mean, clearly, since the 17th century, it's never been worn. It was at the Museum of London for a number of decades and returned to the Society about 4 years ago now.
Brilliant. And another question's come in here. Was the view of Charles as a martyr confined to the aristocracy, or did the commons see him that way as well?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, one of the reasons why the Civil War erupted in the way that it did is that there had been a period during the 1620s which was considered a golden age. I mean, he was popularly known as Good King Charles during those years. He had closed Parliament, and this was really a movement that was happening across Europe at that time, in that parliaments were seen as clumsy, old-fashioned, medieval institutions, and these Baroque new states, which were rather more centralised, were starting to develop. But of course, there was a great deal of vested interest to maintain, particularly amongst Puritan lawyers, to maintain the status quo as it existed. One of the things that Charles did, for instance, was set up courts in York as well, so that the life of justice wasn't only focused on London, but that was in the region of York as well. He formed the post office for the first time. He revalued the currency, the content of silver in the coinage was much improved. And this had a very great effect for all of the people. And it wasn't an aristocratic movement. In many ways, the emerging Puritan middle class was the least in favour of what he was doing, because they had a vested interest for not to be successful, if you like.
Fascinating. And Father, we've mentioned there that that King Charles the Martyr is the first saint that the Church of England has made, and there may be others. Was there any kind of formal canonization process that kind of underwent to kind of make that announcement?
Yeah. So what happened in 1660, between 1660 and 1662, was the formation of those services, morning and evening prayer, in which Charles is named as a saint and named as a martyr as well. And the ancient Anglo-Saxon tradition of forming and recognizing a saint was that there would be a popular cult that would exist and be sustained for a number of years. And we see that during the 1650s, in that churches were being dedicated to King Charles the Martyr during that time and into the 1660s and thereafter. There were these services, and then it was recognised by what was the equivalent of General Synod in the Church, the Parliament at that time, as well as the writing of prayers which name him as a saint. So it was going back to that Anglo-Saxon model. And then, if I can show you, in the 1950s, there was a commission across the Anglican Communion. And it was an important doctrinal matter to be able to establish that the Church of England and the Anglican Communion as a whole was a true church, that it was a church that where being a member of the church, you could go to heaven, you could be saved by being a member of that church, and ultimately saved all the way to being a saint. And so the Commission looked into that process, in particular, of how King Charles had been canonized, and the reason for his martyrdom. The reason for his martyrdom is he could have saved his life if he had set aside the biblical order of deacons, priests, and bishops. But on that point, he couldn't concede, and therefore accepted martyrdom for that principle.
And following on from that, do you think the lasting legacy for King Charles the Martyr is that the Church of England is what it is today? It is a true church because of his actions?
Yeah, yes. And that really goes back to your question about the popularity of it. I mean, it became that icon, that story. I mean, why the icon Basilike ran into so many editions, I mean, dozens and dozens of editions, was because this was, curiously, for a book about a monarch, it was democratized. It wasn't controlled at all. There was no imprimatur of someone saying this is the official record. It was a popular movement that produced the book, and people felt that they knew the king, and particularly knew his conscience, both the good and the failures within it, but how he had won his soul back from the position that he had found himself in life.
Brilliant. We've had another comment come in, Father. Hello, Father. Thank you so much for your interesting and informative talk. I'm intrigued how the cult of St. Charles has spread beyond England and the Church of England. Is there anything else you could say about that?
Yeah, I mean, in America and to some extent in Canada, the Society of King Charles the Martyr is a large organisation, and it particularly focuses on that liturgical life of the church and those traditional forms of worship. So that's where the trust and where the life of the society exists outside the UK.
Brilliant. Well, I think we've got a time for, if there's any, if you've got any other questions, probably got time for maybe one or two more. But Father, what would your, if anyone came to you today and sort of, in a nutshell, why should we remember Charles the Martyr? What would you say to them?
Well, I mean, I suppose it really it overlaps with what a church preservation trust is about, and the value of history. And if we don't remember the history, the likelihood of repeating the mistakes of the past. And the life of King Charles is a very hopeful life. In the end, there's a lot of tragedy within the life, but it's a very inspiring life once you start to study it. And also, I think it's an object of also how there can be bad history and how things get poorly remembered and commemorated. He is someone who is, I think, widely misunderstood. It was interesting that there was that exhibition at the Royal Academy about 4 or 5 years ago, where they reassembled his collection of paintings, and you were seeing the king in a different way than one often sees. A very sensitive collector of art, understanding the arts at a very deep level. He was, of course, a great patron of church building, of architects, and that whole transformation of churches that took place during his reign. And so many of them were absolutely despoiled by the Cromwellians during violent sprees of iconoclasm.
Well, Father, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. If anyone's got any other questions, do comment on our video there and we'll do our best to answer those. As I said at the start of this lecture, this is part of a series of lectures that the Church's Conservation Trust are running. All of these lectures are free of charge to attend, but we hope that you may feel inclined to make a donation to help us care for our historic collection of churches. But if you visit our website, visitchurch.org.uk, and look at our online resources page for the COVID-19 lockdown, you'll see there's a schedule of upcoming talks and lectures that we've got arranged. Next week, we're looking forward to welcoming Dr. Emma Wells from the University of York, who'll be talking about, did Henry VIII really break the church? So hopefully you'll be able to join us for that lecture. But again, thank you so much to Father Charles for taking the time to talk to us today. We really do appreciate it. And if you've got any ideas for other lectures, do let us know. Thank you so much.